Hi, this is John Romano, and this is my lecture, Central Middle Ages in Europe, for my course, World Civilization to 1500. And in this lecture, we're covering the period from around the year 1000 to around the year 1300 in Western Europe. When last we had spoken about the Middle Ages in Europe, we had said that in the early medieval period, Western Europe, in many ways, was in a bad state. And to some degree had a long hangover after the end of the Roman Empire. And we had left in a state in which, politically speaking, it was decentralized. It faced many invasions, and in its economy was not necessarily uniformly at a high level. And we're really going to see from right around the year 1000 on, there is going to be a turnaround of these situations in Europe. And really, it's going to start from what really is a fairly modest cause. Right around the millennium, right around the year 1000, there is going to be a very slight uptick in temperature, really only around a degree hotter. So this meant that the climate in Western Europe was milder, it was warmer, it was less damp. And in spite of the fact that probably many of the people who lived at the time would not necessarily have felt that 1 degree indifference, it's really going to lead to improved agricultural conditions, which, as we'll see, will have a chain effect on many other areas in life in Western Europe. And rather than in the early Middle Ages, when people were really just trying their best to farm the land they already had, at this point now, really there's going to be such an agricultural boom that, in fact, people were going to now go ahead and try to find new areas to farm, to create new agricultural settlements. And in fact, some cases, this is going to involve taking land that had never been brought under cultivation in Europe before. For instance, people will begin to cut down forest. Some people would say deforestation is not a new problem for Western Europe. It had already started at this point. In many other cases, swamps were drained to create new farmland. And this process is going to be very useful in really creating an increased availability of grain through Western Europe. And grain, of course, is food. It sustains growth in population. And really, altogether, we're going to see a fairly well-balanced diet in Western Europe between vegetable proteins, meat, and fish altogether. As part of this process of having more grain, people are also going to cleverly exploit the power of wind and the power of water more often in the form of windmills and water mills. And what this means is that, as opposed to the past, in which people would have to grind grain by hand, at this point now, increasingly people are going to use then these mills, which again rely on water or wind, and that is going to do the work for them, freeing up their hands then to be able to do a lot of other tasks at the same time. As people are doing a lot more agriculture, they're also beginning to think about what kind of technological advances will assist in this process. And one of the things they first recognize is that some of the animals that were previously used for plowing were really not actually as well suited to the task as many had previously thought. And for instance, rather than using oxen as frequently as they had been before, now increasingly people are going to switch to horses. Horses tended to be faster. They tended to be more versatile. You could get them to turn much more easily. And As people begin to use horses more, they're going to use horseshoes a lot more, and better horseshoes, to be able to um, have more wear and tear on the horse. We also, at the same time, they're going to create a better yoke for the horses. Again, this sort of thing that would connect the horse with the plow. Previously, the yoke that Western Europeans had used was one that had really been created in Roman times, and the yoke was very poorly designed. The weight of the yoke actually would go over the throat of the horse. So the more the horse pulled, the more it would be choking itself. So you can understand from the perspective of the horse why they would not want to pull so hard. In this point in Western Europe now, people are going to use a yoke that puts the majority of the weight on the shoulders of the horse. And this is going to mean a happier horse that's willing to pull a little bit more. In addition to changing the yoke, people also will look at the plow itself. Really, they are going to begin to create, especially in the areas of Northern Europe, a plow that was much better suited to the kind of soils that people found in Northern Europe. A plow called the heavy plow that was able to cut through the damp, clayey, heavy soils of Northern Europe. Far better than the previous plow, sometimes known as the scratch plow, that really had been initially created to deal with the soil of the Mediterranean, the Roman world. Another of the innovations in this period was to create what is referred to as the three-field system. Up until this point, Western Europeans had tended to use a two-field system of rotation. So essentially what this means is that one out of every two crops in any given season would be allowed to lie fallow. You wouldn't plant anything on it, so as not to exhaust the soil. What this meant was that in any given season, half of your productive land was being put out of commission. At this time, people switched to a three-field system of rotation, which, as it may well sound, it simply means that only 1/3 of people's fields are going to be allowed to lie fallow in any planting season. Part of this system, too, was recognizing that it really was not just a question of resting the field altogether, but also using different kinds of crops on lands that would help to refresh the land. And so, in addition to grain, Europeans are going to begin to cycle in legumes, peas, for instance, lentils, and beans. These are good anyway for Europeans for nutrition, but they were also very good for the nitrates in the soil, which would actually help to refresh the soil. Altogether, we tend to think, taken as a whole, these innovations in agriculture are going to be very good for the population in Europe as a whole. They're going to have a lot more grain available, so more people will be around, so more people will live, and it will allow them to cut down on the astronomical level of infant mortality in the period previous to this. And this is especially good news for female children who, in a time of resource scarcity, tend to usually die at much larger rates. There's another important and good sort of offshoot of having agricultural success, which is to say that Western Europeans in this period now have a surplus of grain, more than you really need to be able to eat to survive. And this surplus is going to allow for a revival in commerce. And really, altogether, there are going to be more goods exchanged between Western Europeans and elsewhere in the world, and more money is going to begin to be in circulation. And many Europeans are going to begin to sell their own surpluses and begin to purchase other things, many case items that they themselves could not produce. And we're going to see this trend especially among many Italian cities or other cities that are on the Mediterranean. And this, for instance, is the period in which the great city of Venice is going to emerge as a major trading center. And it's not just because Venice famously is located on the water, but because of the agricultural land that surrounded Venice. And what sailors from Venice, what merchants from Venice are going to do is take that grain and other products that are produced locally, wine, lumber. They're going to then sail to the city of Constantinople, the capital city of the Byzantine Empire, and they'll get money from that. And on top of that, selling those goods, they will then turn around and buy luxury items that had been produced further in the East. Think about silk, for instance. And then they could go back and sell those things at a profit to their Italian neighbors. Other Italian cities like Genoa and Pisa follow a very similar pattern. And to some degree, also, these Italian cities will begin to go to some of the crusading states, while Western Europeans own certain parts of the Middle East and trade with them as well, get some of these items. We also see in other places in Western Europe, people begin to specialize in certain items, and in some cases, get involved with trade relationships with others. One example, for instance, was in modern Belgium, where they're known to produce cloth. The thing was, which is very interesting about this, is that they, for the most part, in Belgium, they did not actually raise sheep themselves, or you get the wool themselves. They would have to go to England and trade with them to be able to get the wool, and then in Belgium they would finish it, and they would, for instance, they would dye it, and then in turn they would also trade that. This is the period in which French wine really starts to become a major industry. All sorts of French merchants begin then to trade that further on. In fact, there's so much trading going on, so many merchants who begin to circulate, that to make things much easier, in many cases what begins to happen is that merchants begin to go to these vast international markets in which they could do the trading much more efficiently, and in which many different goods tend to be traded. This just to give you one example, to the east of Paris, one of these major fairs begins to strike up, but in time they become a very common feature of all sorts of territories throughout Western Europe. Now, you may wonder to yourself, did nobles like these merchants? Did they like the fact that merchants were often becoming quite rich? And the answer is no. And in fact, very often traditional nobles resented some of these people. But the nobles were also smart enough to recognize that they would tolerate them because they were also bringing traditional nobles money in the form of taxes. They would tax these merchants to remain on their land. And all the nobles would have to do was, in essence, keep order, make sure everyone was happy, provide money changing, and then the money would roll in the merchants who would pay to stay on this land for a period of time and do their trading. And really, in some cases, these fairs would have a specific days for specific products, or in other cases, they were just a mixture of different products sold all at once. And really, this commerce, especially as represented by these fairs, begins to increase to such a degree now that in many places in Western Europe, they needed to create new coins to be able to handle the volume of trade. Previous to this point, people would simply often use coins that had been minted centuries ago in the Roman Empire. Now that's not good enough anymore. They need their new coins. This new group of this sort of growth of commerce is going to play an important part in stimulating the growth of urban life. We had said that during the early Middle Ages, many cities begin to get reduced down to a far smaller size, and at least some cases we know of cities that disappear completely. And during this period, the money that merchants have is going to allow for older cities to get resettled, and in some cases they begin to found entirely new cities. And this especially occurs when merchants begin to set up colonies. And usually they set up areas that are close to major trade routes. And really, initially, these kind of colonies of merchants tend to be really primitive affairs. They would set up shop close to a castle or a monastery, and then if there's any threat to them, they could simply take refuge in the castle or monastery. But this kind of arrangement was not a very happy one, and when the merchants became prosperous enough, they tend to put up walls, city walls, for protection around their settlements. And in fact, we can actually sometimes even measure the slow increase in the size of cities during this period by seeing how city walls move back and then back some more and then back some more again. Now, still at this period, the population of Western Europe remained overwhelmingly rural, but because of the wealth in cities, these cities exercised a large influence on both economics and political life as well. And in many cases, craft workers would come to the cities. In some cases, people who previously had been laborers on farms. In some cases, people who had been sons of knights. All of these groups of people, in some cases, would simply leave the countryside and then begin to go to the city. And there was a real attraction for these people to go to the cities because people in the city didn't have to pay a large amount of tax money, which was to their nobles, the nobles who lived in the countryside, or do free labor for them. They would have to pay rent, but the rent was much more modest than the kind of taxes and labor that peasants in the countryside had to pay. And in fact, those who ran cities were recognized that how many people were leaving the countryside to escape these old sort of requirements. And so they had a rule that if you managed to live in a city for a year and a day, the old nobles who used to have control over you could no longer ask for your help any longer. Within the city, too, we begin to see both merchants and people, craft workers, beginning to come together and form what are known as guilds. The guilds are really something like the forerunners to modern day unions, an organization that would, first of all, make sure that whatever item they produced was of a high quality, and they would guarantee, in fact, its quality. They also would manage to help their members to, for instance, force people to pay up if they didn't pay. And there also is a major social aspect to members of guilds because you paid your dues. If you died, they would bury you. They would take care of your family as well. And these guilds are going to have a lot of power over the economy because, in essence, they will have a monopoly over whatever thing that they produce within a given city. So, the barrel makers are the only ones who are allowed to produce barrels in a city. And all of these different guilds would have their own patron saints that they would pray to. One of my favorite examples, for instance, this was Saint Sebastian, who, as you can see, was shot with arrows. And this was the patron saint of the tapestry makers because they would use these sort of large, heavy needles that reminded people of arrows. So they prayed to Saint Sebastian. And on the feast day of the saint that the guild venerated, usually the guild would put on this very elaborate festival that everyone in the city was invited to. In this period in which we see a lot of lay development too, we're going to see new religious movements as well. And one of these is not so much a new religious order, but just a new development of an old one. And we're going to the foundation of the very powerful monastery known as Cluny in France. And this is a monastery of Benedictines, but people who felt themselves to be Reformed Benedictines, who were going to carry out, they felt, the words of the rule of St. Benedict much more literally than they had been followed in the past. And they're going to announce this entire program they felt to purify their order, the Benedictines. So, for instance, saying that there should be independence of the church and monasteries from any secular nobles. They're supposed to be apart from them. And they really very strictly required all of the monks to follow the rule. For instance, making sure that they kept celibate and didn't have their own money. The monks of Cluny are also going to demand a strict attending to of monastic duties, especially the liturgy. They were said to have liturgies that would go on for hours and hours because they felt that was one of the major goals that monks had to do. Other religious orders would constitute something of a backlash to the new culture of trading and money that existed at the time. And perhaps the best example of this are shown here. This is the Franciscan order. Francis having his new religious order approved by the Pope. The Franciscans are going to reject wealth. In fact, early Franciscans could not even touch coins. And instead, they were going to essentially walk around in sackcloth, live lives of poverty, and get their money by begging alone. And really, the Franciscans are going to be known for their poverty. As you can see here, this is St. Francis giving all his clothing back to his father, while the scandalized bishop attempts to cover him up. But Francis also is going, and other Franciscans will be known for the power of their preaching. And they go out, for instance, to preach against heretical belief. It's not just, though, religious orders that are taking a position of major leadership within the church. During this time period, we think that the Pope, perhaps more than ever, is going to emerge as a religious leader, calling for a very thoroughgoing reform of the church, making sure, for instance, that priests who previously, in some cases, had mistresses or were unchaste, now they had to very strictly follow the laws of celibacy. In other cases, too, priests would in some cases charge for the sacraments. For getting particularly high offices, they would have to pay money, and these practices are ended. At the same time, too, perhaps more than ever, the Pope is going to emerge as a major political authority. For instance, sponsoring the Crusades, and on top of that, also now beginning to move against and criticize nobles who flouted the rules of the church, including, for instance, in things like getting divorced. So it's not going to be acceptable, for instance, like Charlemagne getting divorced. That is not going to fly any longer. We're also going to begin to see the foundation of a new form of education known as cathedral schools. Now, some of you may say, of course, that education had never really gone anywhere in Western Europe, and certainly it is true that within monasteries, really much of the learning of the ancient world had been kept alive and copied. What I would say, though, is that monasteries very often in their approach during this period were fundamentally conservative, often interested in preserving knowledge, but not necessarily furthering it. And many monasteries didn't have a great understanding of this new commercial life, this new life in cities that was beginning to dominate Western Europe. And what we're going to see now in this period is that many of the important cities are going to begin to have professors, masters, and who are first going to set up shop actually in cathedrals or cathedral grounds, and gradually they will move outside of them. And really, we think that many children of merchants or other professions of those who worked in the city would really want their kids to get education, and really a liberal arts education here. That in fact they felt that being taught a range of subjects, being taught perhaps most importantly how to think, how to reason, how to speak, were the keys to having one's children being successful in the future. By far, the most important cathedral school, and later just university, was in Paris, and again sponsored outside of the University of Notre Dame, shown here. And in fact, a splinter group of professors from Notre Dame will eventually form Oxford, and then yet another splinter group from Oxford will found Cambridge. But it's not just Paris, although Paris was by far the largest congregation of professors and students. In fact, Bologna in Italy would become known for its advanced legal studies, for instance. Within these early universities, there was no campus. In essence, people would rent out rooms right near the cathedral, which were all rented by the professor. And on top of that, by the way, professors would actually have to go around and collect fees from students, which is why many students tried to dodge lecture on days in which their fees were due. The classes were held in Latin, and while this may seem to you to be a strange thing, inasmuch as by this point no one was speaking Latin fluently, or it wasn't a mother tongue to anybody, This was the only universal language that existed, so this was the one they had to use. And just to give you some idea of how students would take notes, this is a modern example of what is known as a wax tablet. And all the students would have one of these. They wouldn't be able to afford books, but you could get a wax tablet, and you could use your stylus there to take notes in lecture. The one downside of this is that you only had one of these, and so when you had filled up your wax with all the notes you're going to take, you could memorize whatever you chose to memorize, and then you could heat up the wax, smear it again, and use it from scratch. So I don't need to tell you, this really trains your memory quite quickly. The major intellectual and philosophical movement that starts up in the universities was one usually referred to as scholasticism. Scholasticism begins to probe very serious questions, like, for instance, the relationship between reason and revelation. What is the nature of human life? What are the attributes of God? What is the relationship between the divine and the human? Most people at this time would have believed that there was a God already, but can you, for instance, prove that by using rational argumentation alone, such as you could actually go out and convince someone, for instance, who's outside the faith, that God exists? And so it was believed that this kind of intellectual effort could actually help to deepen one's faith. Now, one of the very interesting things about scholasticism was that rather than just summing up what traditional authorities, like, say, for instance, the Bible or the church fathers had said, very often what would happen is people would debate these issues. They would notice that sometimes there were actually contradictions between authoritative sources. And because there could be no contradiction in truth, it was left to you as the master and the student to figure out how there really was no contradiction. So debate was really built into this system of learning. The greatest intellectual of this age was the man pictured here on the left, known as Peter Abelard. Peter Abelard really did have a stormy career, although many people would say he mastered scholasticism like no one else. Abelard was the son of a knight, but for him, he poured his fighting, he said, into teaching and learning. And really, at his early time in his career, he really was dissatisfied with all his teachers, and he went around, in essence, defeating them in public debate to show that he was better than them. And he taught philosophy, and then eventually he studied theology, which was seen to be the highest of the fields of study because of what it touched on. And he begins to do things that are really showing off his just raw skill. So, for instance, some of his fellow students at one point challenged him with very little preparation time to give a series of public lectures on the biblical book of Ezekiel, which was known to be obscure. And with little time, Abelard performed brilliantly and spoke very well. Altogether, we think that Abelard had all sorts of intellectual fame in his time, and he was beloved by his students and admired by other intellectuals. And so he eventually will go to Paris, which was, as I said, is the seat of universities at the time. There, his reputation follows him, gains all sorts of loyal students. He was handsome, he was formidable in argumentation. All of these things were the case. But sadly, he ends up getting himself involved in a tragic love affair with the person pictured to the right, Heloise. And eventually, Abelard decides to live with a local priest in Paris, and with really the initial deal seemed to be one that was logical. He would live with this priest, and the priest would his family would take care of his room and board, and in turn, for that, Abelard would teach the priest's young niece, Heloise. And really, I should say before I go any further that Heloise does herself actually master all kinds of texts and really actually becomes herself quite learned. Unfortunately, though, Abelard ended up teaching her a lot of things that went beyond her intellectual lessons, and after a short period of time, it was discovered that she was pregnant. Abelard wanted to marry her, but fearing that this might interrupt his career, Heloise was happy to live as his mistress instead. Abelard, of course, would move out. The priest was thoroughly humiliated and dishonored and ended up hiring a group of ruffians to break into Abelard's new house, and they ended up castrating Abelard. At this point, with any real possibility of a married life really being closed off from them, Abelard would enter the religious life in a monastery near Paris, and Heloise would become a nun. And in fact, I should say, Heloise actually becomes really quite a good guide of souls, and really quite responsible in her position. And we know, though, that she never entirely got over Abelard. And really, she would write to him these passionate letters, whereas Abelard would write back to her very impersonally and formally. Things, unfortunately, did not settle down for Abelard. He would end up quarreling with his own monks, who apparently at some point decided that they wanted to kill him because he really was very strict about monastic observance and wanted them to be as well. In time, certain of Abelard's doctrines would be attacked as being heretical, and really, to some degree, some people felt that Abelard had such faith in human reason that he was going to use it to explain even things that really went beyond the powers of just rational argumentation. So something like, for instance, the Trinity, which really was just a matter of faith in many people's eyes, not something you could really logically spell out. Eventually, Abelard would be condemned, his writings, by a local church council. They would force him to burn one of his books publicly, and he was silenced. He could no longer publicly teach. In spite of this somewhat sad end, we do think that this really, in some ways, Abelard pushes forth in spite of the controversy that occasioned his method. This idea that we're supposed to be applying critical reason to, for instance, sacred texts, and really, in some ways, beginning to push forward the discipline of theology. One of the other things that this new commercial system that we have been discussing created was a new need for law. I had mentioned to you earlier that law certainly existed in early medieval Europe, but it very often was something that resided in the hands of powerful nobles, who normally were the ones who judged their own peasants according to whatever they saw fit to do. Increasingly, though, as the amount of trade, of commerce, of banking begins to pick up, what people begin to find is this sort of a ragtag system of law doesn't actually respond to the many new questions that are created when people begin to bring lawsuits against one another for commercial matters. And in fact, what people recognize is that they needed to hail back to an earlier system of law that dealt with exactly these sort of complicated questions at a time when there was a lot more commerce. And this is why people begin to increasingly turn again to Roman law. And in Roman law, people could really find a system that not only dealt with a lot of different complicated issues, was also a system that prized order. And so, really, we'll see during this period is lots of scholars begin to have this enthusiasm for turning back to classical Roman law. And one of the most important moments in this is when where scholars from Western Europe will rediscover a copy of the Roman law that had been codified during Justinian's time. And they'll copy it, then they'll spread it throughout different parts of Western Europe. And masters who will really focus on the law will begin to draw upon Roman law to hammer out new legal codes that bound people in Western Europe. And really, Roman law was this sophisticated law that was organized according to rational principles. And really, although people did not necessarily borrow from it in the same exact way in different parts of Western Europe, you can see people very freely taking from Roman law and being influenced by it as they think about, for instance, how to create new law. And perhaps just even more important than introducing new laws, we really see a reintroduction via Roman law of the idea of a state, of the idea of having a government that is a public authority that has the power of legislation. Not any longer this idea that law is something private in the hands of nobles. Increasingly now, the law is going to be seen as something that is concentrated in a powerful monarch, centralized law. Along with this, then, what we're going to see, the idea of a state developing, is now much more powerful monarchies than had existed in early medieval Europe. And really, the beginnings of what we might refer to as national monarchies. And really, the two main examples I'll deal with here are France and England. The first of these two examples involve what are known now, this new dynasty of French kings are known as Capetians. So these are the Capetian kings. Now, we didn't really mention the Capetians as a family earlier, but this was the family that would eventually displace the old Carolingian family, and in fact rule all the way until the French Revolution. And although really the Capetian kings only start off as a minor noble family, and it was during all the time of chaos in France during the Viking raids that they were able to build up a power base and eventually seize the position of king. Initially, the Capetian kings had very little power indeed. In fact, at their lowest point, they only had Paris and a small area around it. But they did have two major advantages over other noble families. The first of these is that, like clockwork, the Capetians produced a new male heir with every generation, and that is very important for any noble family, but especially when you're king, you have to have someone to put on the throne. The second thing that the Capetian kings managed to do is they begin to require that all of their heirs before the old heir dies, they will receive a series of special blessings, and they will be anointed by a bishop. And this special religious sanction will set them above other noble families. They have been blessed by God. Over a period of centuries, what we're going to see is that the Capetian kings are going to very slowly begin to add to the territory in France under their direct authority, and really from a variety of different methods. They will, for instance, discipline other nobles who they feel have done something wrong and then strip them of land. They sometimes will simply take land from nobles who die. They will begin to marry very well. And the end process is eventually going to be that virtually all of modern day France will come under the authority of the Capetian kings. The English monarchy is going to develop in a slightly different way. The founders of the new English monarchy in this period are going to be people known as the Normans. And these are actually going to be descendants of Vikings who had carved out a state in Normandy in northwestern France. And for a long time, were going to build up an independent and a tightly centralized state. And in fact, their army of the Normans was known to be disciplined and really had influence throughout Europe. In the late 11th century, however, what we're going to see is the Normans, led by the famous William the Conqueror, shown here, are going to invade England and basically strip it from the previous kings who had held it. Once they get there, the Normans will introduce the same principles of government that had served them well in Normandy. Centralizing realm under one king. They're going to begin to tax very effectively. They're going to also really begin to see the king as the source of all power, as all justice. And really, in effect, the same thing will happen under the Capetian kings as well. Again, this process of centralization of things like taxation and justice. And in fact, both the Normans and the Capetians, once they undergo this process of centralizing the territory underneath them, then they will begin to attack all nobles who are still independent and try to force them essentially in a situation where they can no longer carry out private warfare. Warfare is supposed to be something under the king. This, of course, does not stop the kings from fighting. In fact, interestingly enough, although they go through this very similar process in some ways, the Norman kings of England and the Capetian kings of France are going to battle against one another quite frequently. However, as a whole, really we think that these two powers are going to really serve as very powerful regional monarchies that maintain order and begin to create something that looks a lot more to us like government. And that really is going to point toward the future in Western Europe. All right, that's it. Thank you.